Yeah, that's super, super interesting. Actually, I think one of the things that we have also found is the more work you can do for, in your case, it's like your client's client, right? Or your client's lead. It's 1 point off of that direct connection. You almost have to do that work for them. And it absolutely
Yeah,
doesn't scale early on. I mean, we do this all the time where it's like literally writing the email or building the message for them to send to somebody.
100%.
And sometimes that's what it takes. And a lot of founders think like, there's no way I'm going to do that. Like I'm building a product company that doesn't scale. It doesn't, I don't make margin on that. But often to get lift off,
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about, is doing a lot of those very, very manual things.
There's so much of this. And I think it's like you talk to investors who shy away from anything manual, and all the pressure is like, oh, don't know that you shouldn't do that. But in reality, you kind of have to early days. I certainly don't know a way around it.
What's the most manual thing any of us have had to do for an extended period of time to try to convert?
Think of a whole bunch.
And
I mean, I think
how far back are we going? I mean,
Go back as far as you want.
I used to go door to door. I mean,
So show up at somebody's work.
yeah.
Yeah.
Harder to do these days with security, but
with COVID. One example for us, I mean, I sort of mentioned this, but we have, as part of the, we'll help you identify happy customers, before we built that integration in a tech way, we would just pull all of their G2 reviews that they have as a company, every single one of them, put them into a CSV and start to list out, like, here are the 5, filter by 5 stars. And some of the, if any of you know G2, some of those are anonymous, or they have the first name dot last initial, and they give their role types. So we'd be getting on LinkedIn trying to identify who is this person doing. So lots of manual searching and filtering.
The one thing I'll mention, just riffing off of Angela, and actually a comment that came in about reducing friction post-purchase, but I think that's actually a really important thing to note. Two things to note. One is reducing friction throughout the entire customer journey is really important, and specific activation. You see a lot of people throwing paywalls in front of folks, or sort of registration walls, collecting information. Because ultimately, right, they're like, I've got to get a name, I've got to get, I want to engage with this person. I think those things are all true, but like ultimately, think about sort of the journey and where you can reduce friction in that journey. So, if it's, just think carefully, like, is this the right place in which I'm trying to engage and introduce friction, where like, getting the name and contact information is the right time and place. Do I have enough of a relationship with this, individual at this moment where I can request that, and do experimentation. A lot of this is around running A/B testing. It's important to say, and sort of every stage, every time I'm doing activation, always running experiments, always saying, if I do a low friction way versus a high friction way, what are the outcomes, and which one ends up giving me a better funnel down the road? And I think a lot of people don't do that. It's expensive, it's time consuming, but taking every single portion of your process and constantly thinking about the activation step and saying, how can I A/B test this, is really, really important. And it often, that A/B testing shouldn't just be like different language, but literally like different amounts of friction in the process, what I'm asking for, how I'm delivering it, et cetera. I think that's super important. And the other thing that I will say is just, that's very tactical. I see a lot of startups, a lot of companies in general, who don't pre-assign metrics for success in all these activities. They basically say, I'm going to go do these 15 things, and a few things. They don't really establish metrics for success, and so ultimately they don't know whether they've succeeded or failed. And so you see a lot of people spending money in ways that they can't quantify whether or not it's having impact. In fact, I can tell you, when I first walked into Divvy Cloud, we were doing a ton of online advertising, but we had no quantifiable way to say whether that was having impact. Zero. And so it was just, it was just money being spent. And I shut it all down. Literally, we stopped spending any money on online ads until we could build a system in which we were able to establish goals, track those against metrics, and really find that the whole way through. And so I think sometimes you have to be very brave about saying, if I don't know how I'm going to measure this, and if I don't know how to define success, then I'm just not going to do it, because I have to be smart enough to actually do that work first, or this is all just wasted effort and wasted dollars. It may feel good because you're like, I'm doing stuff, but that's not a good reason to do it. And so I do think that you have to be really harsh and brutal about yourself in that world. Yeah.
Chris, I think that we as founders are really good at coming up with reasons and justifying why we're the exception to the rule of like, oh, well, we don't have to measure this. We just know we have to do it anyway. And it's such a trap. I have done it myself many times. It's such a trap. But when you, and even if it's not money, right? Even if it's just your time going into things, same sort of thing. It's like that extra level of mental schlep that is required in saying, here's what we think the impact of this is going to be. Even if it's not like 75% extra activation in this week with 10 people, like it doesn't have to be ultra quantitative, as long as there is some measurable hypotheses that you have about how it's going to move the needle. I think applying that as a consistent rule across any efforts or anything you're testing is so important and so easy to just skip over.
And I think people are scared of setting goals, right? And they say, well, what if I don't hit them? Well, okay, that's fine. I mean, again, it's okay to set a goal and miss it. It's not a failure, but you have to have a benchmark in which you can say, I define success as this. If I'm not hitting that here, but I'm hitting it somewhere else, then I should double down on the places where I'm meeting my goal, and I should look at the thing where I'm not, and I should experiment to find if I can optimize to get to that. And if I can't, then I need to look at the ROI and the ROR, the return on investment and the rate of return of each of these different strategies, and again, starve the ones that aren't particularly successful and invest more heavily in the ones that are. But we just don't see that kind of rigor in most organizations. Forget startups. Yeah. Because it requires you to gather it requires real discipline. It requires things like cohort analysis, because you can't just group all this stuff together. So it is really putting together from day one an investment in this. And I will say, I often think that startups don't invest early enough often in sort of what I think is like a first 10 hire is in the sort of marketing, sales, technology, data person who's focused, who can actually build all the things required to do this. Because at the point that you're then ready to scale and invest dollars, if you don't have all that in place, you're just really inefficient in them, and you're not getting the sort of results you want. And so I think it's a super early hire for someone who's just going to focus on building this out, building your marketing tech stack out, building out your analytics and your data, and being able to share that and track it.
We've struggled with that internally a little bit at Growth U, and to the point where this summer we kind of jerked the wheel into trying to capture a lot more lead velocity. Because I thought, again, to Angela's point and Chris' point, as a founder, I'm like, we need leads. We just need a ton of leads, and we successfully got a ton of leads. We blew our metrics out of the water. It was great. Cost per lead was cheap. But then a month later, there was no conversions. So you're like, what the hell just happened there? And well, it turns out that I don't know if it was too much friction or too little friction or the wrong value prop. I think what it mostly came down to was that our sales process, our activation journey is a multi-month process. And we thought that we could just churn on a bunch of, fire on all cylinders for lead gen and capture leads and just convert them. But as Aoife here knows, it doesn't work that way. It's many, many touch points. It's trying to understand that source attribution. It's trying to understand what content is resonating. And so the lesson there was like, okay, well, we failed because we didn't convert, but then we pulled back on that spend and refocused a lot of that energy into more organic content strategy. And now we're seeing compounding returns from that. But it's I think as founders, you need to be open to both setting the goal, to Chris's point, failing, owning it. I take full responsibility for that. It was my decision to push the team in that direction. So I own that responsibility, but then learn from what just happened and then course correct and adjust as you go. And I think that's a big part of the game. Those are some of the things that we've been working on. Which leads me to a question. I guess this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but Aoife, I'll put you on the spot. How do we know, what are the signals that somebody is going to convert into a paying customer? And this is very kind of industry specific, but what are the things that you're looking for as a marketer, as an activation marketer, that says, you know what, I think this cohort of user is close?
I guess in general, I would say the very first thing is engagement. If they're not engaging with anything you're doing, they're very unlikely to convert. So if you're getting some engagement, it is a starting point to be able to get them to engage further. I guess what Growth University and what we've seen, and I know Craig can allude to it as well, is when they actually interact with us, whether it's a Slack message, whether it's an email, whether it's even as much as like a downloaded form, if we can get them in from someplace and get them to do something else, they're a lot more likely to. Once they start expressing interest in us as people and our advice, given the type of industry we're in, where, you know, ed tech and all of this kind of space, people are really looking for experts. There's a lot of noise out there. If they trust us, and the starting part of that trust is asking us the questions and being satisfied with the answers, they're much, much closer to converting. And I know it's something we've started to see a lot with, particularly on Craig's side, and you may allude to it as well, in terms of like getting on the phone and sales calls. The conversion rate on those are so much better than the general get a lead in and send an email, because they're talking to the person who's going to be leading to the course that we will run. So they've gotten this firsthand human interaction. And again, one of those things, again, that doesn't scale infinitely. There's only so many calls we can put Craig on in a day before it turns into a cloning machine of sorts. But when they interact with us as people, they're a lot more likely to trust us in terms of the content and in terms of what we're saying we can do in terms of saving them time and helping them build their playbook for growth.
Because those are leading indicators, right? Because the problem with looking at activation through like a revenue lens is that revenue is always going to be a lagging indicator of what you're doing kind of in the upper part of the funnel, the middle part of the funnel. So I think understanding what those actions and metrics are for your particular business is really, really critical. I guess, Angela, I'm curious, how are you thinking about this? Like when do you know if somebody is kind of kicking the tires or more of a viable lead?
So because our ACVs, our contract values are higher and we're in B2B, the volume of folks is lower. So it's a little easier to see without, like one thing I've been interested in as a quick aside is all like correlated and all of these new CRMs that are basically for product-led growth type companies. So looking at a lot of the indicators you're talking about of maybe a freemium user, how they're using you, and you can start to see signals that like this person used you 5 times this day, invited 6 different users, that sort of thing. We are sort of on the other spectrum in terms of volume of customers and users. So for us, it's much more in the sales process. We can see indicators in the first call or in the speed of follow-up or the questions they ask. There's some patterns that start to emerge of like, oh, this person seems actually really interested. The language they use, it's some of the like the hacked versions of what Gong tells you based on patterns in your sales conversations for us.
Yeah, Craig, I think if I'm thinking about high volume, there's a few things that I think about. First is I want to do lead grading. So the moment that I've identified a person, right? So often when we're starting in the buyer journey, the person is anonymous, and we may have some data that we've collected about them, just based on cookies and things like that. So we've seen them before, et cetera, right? So we may have some view of who that person is, but we don't necessarily know a lot about them demographically. But as soon as we've made contact with them, to the extent we can gather demographic data, then we want to try and make some sort of lead grade. And so, for example, if I'm running a B2B business, a student is not going to be a high grade as a likely buyer relative to, say, a CFO if I'm selling a financial services product, right? And so I can immediately make some judgment based on demographic information. I think that's pretty important. And then I marry that with all the touch points that go forward, right? And to what Angela was saying, I'm starting to build a lead score for that person off of that lead grade, right? And each behavioral activity they do should have some weighted either positive or negative impact into that lead score that gives me some indication. So if they unsubscribe from an email, from me, that's just as important. Those negative attributions are just as important as the positive attributions. Because if I only look at the positive attributions, I can say, oh, this looks like it's going great. They've downloaded a case study. But if they just then immediately unsubscribed from the email that they signed up to as part of that, that probably means they just wanted the white paper and they're out, right? And so you have to look at both positive and negative attributions that build a lead score. And then in that high volume world, you're leveraging that lead score to refine the investment and the touch points you're delivering to that person. And then you're usually marrying that with other buying intent data as well, right? That you're looking, so you can be using groups like TechTarget or others that are aggregating intent based on consumption of content elsewhere on the internet, and servicing that. And so you bring all this together into an amalgam that allows you to then see that. I will say that, things that I've always looked at in the past that are clear indications, and these should be no-brainers, but like free trials, right? Those are obviously things that are important. But just visiting the pricing page, right, is a pretty key indicator of interest. And I've always been thought is a really like key element. If someone's interested in how much your product costs, that means they're thinking about buying your product. And so stuff like that, you even when you're thinking about those behavioral characteristics that you drive into a lead score, has this person visited your pricing page, right? Have they engaged with the buying process? Those are things that we want to look at and feed in, and then we want to automate that so that ultimately, when they've hit a certain trigger, when they've done certain things, when their lead scores hit a certain level, we then trigger some sort of automated routine that it says, okay, they've just hit that level. Now let's engage with them in a different way, right? So
that's really interesting. And then on the trigger side, I mean, that's a whole different conversation that we can get really into the weeds on. But I can say that most of the faster growing startups, I guess, that I've seen are quite sophisticated under the hood with drip campaigns, sequences, automations. I mean, like if you come into our ecosystem and you downloaded something about a program on Facebook, you're in like a Facebook specific sequence that's trying to add more value about what you would learn from that program on Facebook. I mean, we've spent a lot of time on this. That's a lot of area of focus that IFA has here, but don't underestimate both the amount of work, level of effort there and amount of time you need to put into that. But it generally pays to do that personalization. But I'd say like nothing really beats that highly personalized, some of that one-to-one outreach that, if you're in a lower volume scenario, more the B2B sales side, you can do that. Whereas maybe on the B2C side, you can't really. This has been fascinating. I want to take a couple of the questions from the audience because we've got plenty more topics that we can go through, but we'll throw this out for the panel from Amina, who asked, what is the best way to make your brand a quote love brand, where your social media community is involved in the success of your business, which would enable co-building the product with this community and people's feedback? Does anybody want to take that on?
I have some thoughts related to social proof. I don't know if it's exactly answering the question, but maybe we can, other folks on the panel can jump in. Cool. My read on what you're getting at, and feel free to chat if this is right or wrong, but is leveraging happy customers to grow and building a community. Is that, yeah, okay, cool. Thanks for the quick reply. So, I mean, a lot of what we do is couched in the principle of social proof, which is basically Julie is using an iPhone. I'm like, Julie, ooh, I should use an iPhone too. Obviously much more complicated than that, but in its simplest form. And it works really, really well, right? It's rampant in consumer. I think of brands like Away Luggage, which maybe has fallen a little bit in terms of its favor, but did that incredibly well, right? You see people like Karlie Kloss and all these famous people using these suitcases, and you're like, I need this as well. But it also works really well in B2B. And I think, so I chatted with the VP of marketing at PandaDoc a month or two back, and he basically said, I think it was something like, we can do all the branding, messaging, positioning that we want, but our customers can do a better job of selling for us. So let's just let them do it. So there's so many aspects to what you're talking about, community. Maybe Craig and Eva, you can get more into this, but one thing that I think is really important is figuring out where your customers are already talking about you and then leveraging that. It doesn't always have to be a case study. In fact, sometimes it shouldn't be a case study, but if you know that folks are talking about you on Reddit, or that folks are leaving reviews, you can go lo-fi with screenshots and just make sure you start to create a little bit of a flywheel of featuring people who are talking about you, putting their words first, feeding that into your product marketing and your website copy, and then requesting more happy customer input. So there's a ton of different channels, and you can kind of build out the whole strategy that's a map of what's most appropriate for you. But this works across the funnel, from pre-sale through post-activation product education. Happy to get into specific examples, but it works really, really well.
Yeah, and I would add on to that. Everything there is spot on. I would add, I think, look, the counting Facebook likes or, or things of similar nature is surface level stuff, right? What you want to do is engage in conversations, not just about your product, but about your category and about your space. And I think the brands that are the brands that are really, that create love brands, you'll notice they don't talk about themselves. They're engaged with the community on the topic that they love. And so they are active in that conversation. So it's not, look, most places, basically, if you look at their social media presence, they talk about themselves a lot. And they don't have conversations. They're not really, because it's expensive and it's time consuming and it's hard. But the really good brands are the ones that are going out and having conversations online across different mediums, and being thoughtful and real and honest in their conversations, taking stances that may or may not be popular. And that's not like just putting out hey, let's have a conversation. It's literally finding the people who are your community and seeing what they are writing and engaging in those conversations with them. And through that, building a brand that people are thinking about because you are part of their day-to-day conversations. And so I don't think it's about trying to create the community. It's finding that community and engaging with them in a way that they see you as an authentic, honest, transparent brand in which you are a real actor in that community. And if you do that, they will love you because you will be you'll be one of them. And so I think too many brands think about how they build their community versus finding the community and becoming part of it. And then also holding a mirror up to that community and saying, how does the community see us in social media? Let's let that drive some of our branding decisions, right? Rather than us trying to manipulate the other way around, which is like, let's build a brand that manipulates them. And so I just think that like changing the perspective of how we think about social media is really important. Very few people can do this successfully because, again, it's quite hard. It's really expensive. It's really time consuming. You have to have the person who can go in and do that. Hiring a $30,000 a year, dollar a year social media person is not going to do this because they're not going to be able to have those conversations. So it's a very difficult strategy, which most companies are unsuccessful in doing.
Yeah, I think it is like community is one of those things, and we've been talking a lot about it at GU. Like creating community is nearly next to impossible because people have communities, and like in the online space, it's so easy to say like we're going to set up another Slack group, we're going to set up another Facebook group, we're going to set up a LinkedIn thing, and then after 3 weeks, no one's commenting on doing anything, and they've forgotten that you exist, and now you're just a blip of a notification. And on Chris's point, like actually like finding where they are and just being in there with them and embracing it from that standpoint, as opposed to being the building up the blocks on the walls. And just in terms of like a love brand, and for me, it's definitely a love brand, and I talk about it all the time, and Craig will laugh when I say it again, but the Morning Brew is an example that I always talk about. And for anyone who knows them, they've built this incredible referral network. I think 30% of all of their people come in from people referring it, but they've actually built out from their core product all of the rest of their offerings based on what people were asking them to write about. So that people were literally responding back to this giant email newsletter being like, I want you to write about tech. Like, I love that article on tech. So they now have a tech brew that you can get twice a week into your inbox, and really leveraging what people are saying, and not just taking it as like, oh, they left a nice comment. Like, what are they really saying and what are they really doing? And I just see in the chat, the very next question, I think probably alludes to that too. Like, how do you just de-risk campaigns and optimize? Like, ask people who have already converted why they converted. Like, the easiest way to de-risk is like ask the people who are already doing it why they did it, and see how you can replicate that out again.
Yeah, spot on. I would second Aoife's comments on, building community is kind of all the buzz right now. Everybody raising money is talking about how they're building these communities, but it is it's incredibly hard. And what you might find, actually, it's funny. One of our community members was like, building a community is not about a Slack group or about a Discord server or about the tech. And that's where a lot of people go when they talk about like trying to get a community off the ground. What is community is like peer-to-peer engagement. It's conversations, to Chris's point. And I mean, we're all circling around this, and it is definitely not in the faint of heart to take it on yourself. So while you may see that it looks like everybody's building community and trying to build community, it's actually really, really hard to do that. And I think if you're going to do that, look at some of those adjacent communities that you can start to tap into, and then you'll figure out what your own voice is. The second question there, I think, from Ekaterina, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is what's the minimum viable amount of prep work for you? I think in relation to building new campaigns, and I think this gets into a little bit of experimentation and kind of like how much risk are you willing to take on kind of with the leads that are in your funnel and in your flow. And one of the questions that I had coming into this was I wanted to challenge us to think about what are some of the crazy things we've done to try to move people through that buyer journey. I mean, there's no real way to force it, but we're constantly experimenting with it. Does anybody have any like funny stories or anything to share? Chris, go ahead.
I just want to say the minimum viable amount of prep work is set the goals, set how you're going to measure them, right? I mean, that's literally the minimum.
Right.
Like, to me, like if you haven't done that, then there's no point in doing it. So it's, what are my goals? How am I going to measure? What's the length of the campaign? It's like, that's the minimum. It doesn't look, you don't have to put a ton of prep work in, but you have to have at least those things. I mean, you can do, quick turnaround campaigns, but again, it just requires that rigor to know what to state whether they will be successful or not. Like, what the outcomes are going to be and what success looks like. And because that's what I see over and over again is just people don't do that. They don't say what success will look like, and they get to the end of the campaign and someone says, was it successful? And they go, of course it was, because it makes them feel good, right? And we're human. Of course we want things to be successful, and we'll create justifications. We'll say, yeah, we got 10 leads. It was amazing. Well, if you had started at the beginning of the day and said, I wanted 100 leads and you got 10 leads, you'd say, no, this was not a successful campaign. Mm-hmm. But after the fact, you can justify it by saying like 10 leads. I mean, that seems incredible, like let's do this again. And so I just think that's the minimum amount of work you always have to put in. Like, honestly, like if you just do that, and you want, and by the way, what you want from that also is, I think to be more specific, is you want to know what the return on investment is going to be. And you want to know what the rate of return is going to be. It's not enough to say ROI. It has to be like, I'm going to receive this return in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks. And then to your point earlier, Craig, you have to put it for things that are longer play. You have to have both leading and trailing indicators of success. So a trailing indicator of success, to your point, is revenue. I got revenue, B2C, B2B, doesn't matter. But what are the leading indicators of success? How many leads did I get, right? How many downloads did I get? Whatever the number is. But are there other metrics I can track? Because if I'm running this campaign over a period of 6 months and it takes 6 months to move through to revenue, I want to have earlier indicators of success. So if I make experiments, if I make changes to the campaign mid-cycle, I can break the cohorts apart and I can evaluate success based on the early leading indicators. That I'm not waiting until the very end of the campaign. That's too long. So I've got to have goals set for every single one of those leading and trailing indicators. It can't just be at the end. So that's the minimum to me, is that I put in place that rigor where I will know whether I've been successful or not quickly, and I can make adjustments and track them. Again, that's the bare minimum. Everything else is table stakes.
Well stated. Yeah, totally agree with all of that. And I think there's some areas here where, I'm going to challenge my own thinking in terms of how we're thinking about that, some of those goals and those leading indicators. Okay, so question for the panel. Either crazy experiment or tactic that you've used to try to drive conversions that's either worked or totally failed, or an example of a company out there that you think is just crushing it in terms of like you'll basically buy anything from them because they're able to, they've just got you. They were able to hook you and activate you and you buy. What comes to mind?
In terms of like stuff I've tried, I don't know if you remember this, but at one stage I worked in like a travel list department, and we were trying to get people to buy the trip, and we felt like the friction point was like they didn't know when to book the trip. It was around a very specific event, and so what we did for a couple of weeks is we manually created custom links for their page. So like the booking page, we had their dates inputted, but we'd manually go look them up, figure out when the event was going to be, go back, create the URL ourselves, then manually send it over to them with the hope that it would take them that one step through that confusion part and get them to convert. We ended up automating it after a while. It worked well. It didn't work as well at scale. There was obviously so many URLs you can put together in a day before your eyes slightly go cross-eyed. But it was one of those things where it took so long, and I vividly remember it still, like sitting at the computer and like essentially just booking people's travel without getting their credit cards and just like pushing out links, like here's your link, here's your link, here's your link. But I think discounts for a lot of people are like the go-to in this scenario. I think it's one of the easier things to do when you're trying to increase conversions. Like, well, if we only charge them this much, which can work, but I'm always cautious of it. As Craig knows, because I think doing it too often, you set an expectation of behavior, and you also want to be careful not to devalue yourself in the process of doing it. But I think discounts are usually one of the go-tos for a lot of startups and fully established and running companies too.
It doesn't quite fit in the category of I will buy anything from them because I'm just not their target customer at all. But there's a company out there, if anyone knows Dooley, Doolly, and their B2B company basically, I'm going to butcher this, but basically make it easier for salespeople to automate Salesforce entry. And they are doing, yes, Dooley's awesome. So they are doing some really wild stuff, wild in the context of B2B, which you think of as just stodgy. They did, I think one or more of the members of the band, the Chainsmokers, is on there, or angel investors in their company. And so they did this whole Vegas getaway to go see the Chainsmokers in Vegas. They do a lot of like individual people on their team do rap videos that are just very not what you'd expect from a B2B perspective. So they're doing a lot, I think, at minimum to pierce through the noise. And they seem to have a contingency of like a tight knit community of sales AMs worth looking at.
It looks like a fun brand too. A lot of the, it was Dave Gerhardt says that you're selling to a human. There's no B2B sale. It's like B2B and B2C is all kind of merged together, but they've got it's just a fun kind of whimsical brand. Yeah. How about you, Chris? Any crazy stories around like trying to convert people, failures, experiments that you've done?
Lots of failures, mostly failures. No, but really, I mean, most things will fail, right? I mean, that's the reality, at least the first time. And it's about knowing that it's failed and being able to modify. I mean, look, almost all the campaigns that you end up doing can be optimized. And you can only know that if you are really I hate to harp on metrics, but it's like the reason I know I've failed more often than I've succeeded on first blush is because we track this stuff. And we can recognize, the goals and outcomes, and that's time consuming. But yeah, I mean, I'll tell you what, one of the things that we had a lot of success with, we at DivvyCloud, we did a lot of trade shows. It was one of our, we were enterprise B2B play, average contract value and, north of $200,000. So, recurring revenue. So, reasonable size purchases. And so we would find a lot of our enterprise buyers at trade shows. And we built a mechanism which at trade shows, you can have a lot of people going by you that you don't have a chance to interact with. And so we built a mechanism which we would give away a substantial prize. We were often doing the Millennium Falcon Lego kit. If you took a postcard from us and then filled out what was eventually like a 10 to 15 minute survey, which gave us a ton of information about everybody who went by who didn't engage with us. And I'll tell you, that was wildly successful, but we occasionally tried to switch it up. At one point we gave away an e-bike instead of the Millennium Falcon. And I will tell you, most people came up and were like asking us if we sold e-bikes. and quite literally, like, no one signed up. Like, it was so
that's a pretty good failure. That's a good failure.
it was an insane failure. Like literally everyone was coming up to me like, so wait, you guys sell e-bikes? Well, no, the e-bike is part of this giveaway. And they just
Oh my God.
And it was
On that note,
it was miserable. So I'll tell you, like you got to know what success looks like and your goals. But yeah, that was you got to experiment. Sometimes not always successfully.
I think it's a great way to close it up.